I mean, I can't recall in the years I've been working a crime quite as bad as this one. This is like the nightmare of parents. I mean, he threatened to slit their throats. He threatened to kill their parents. So you can imagine a 6 and 9-year-old, and you're being told he's gonna kill you. And again, it was Judge Peter Carney. He said the offences were just too serious to consider a reduction in the maximum sentence, and he sentenced them to life.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. They are the killers and the rapists deemed so dangerous that they are serving life sentences behind bars. But what does life mean in Ireland? And while the sentence is mandatory in murder cases, how does a sex offender reach the maximum term lockup? Today, I'm talking to journalist Eamon Dillon about the 350 prisoners doing life behind bars, about the Gangland triggermen on the promise of blood money who found themselves counting the costs of their chosen career, about the evil rapists whose crimes abhorred society, and about the parole board and what it will mean for those looking for early release. This is Crime World, a podcast from SundayWorld.com. Eamon, I imagine the most frequent question you're asked when it comes to work is, what does a life sentence mean in Ireland?
Well, it's been I suppose, a movable feast over the years. There's some research done recently by someone far more academic than either of us. And believe it or not, some of the life sentences in the early 70s, people were getting out after 7.5 years in 8 years. And then certainly when we were starting out in the Sunday World, or not starting out in the Sunday World, but when we were first joined the Sunday World, I think kind of the average lifers would have been doing 11 to 12 years. That would have been sort of around 2000. And recently enough, in my head, I had the idea that it was around 18 years. But now it turns out it's something like 22 years seems to be the average life sentence. So it's creeping up the whole time. I think, and you can argue it's not that people are getting tougher. I think that sometimes, I suppose, it's the value of life is being recognised more. That, you know, we've come on as a society, you know, in that intervening time, and as much as as much as everything else is you know, people's lives and the effect that crime has on them is taken as being more serious. And it's not necessarily that we've become kind of Texan style, just lock them up and throw away the key. I think it's a recognition of like the pain that victims go through, and it never ends. And I mean, I know we've both done interviews over the years with families of people, you know, who have a relative who've been murdered, and it's like it just happened yesterday. And you know, whether it's a cold case from the 1970s or something from last year, it's something that doesn't leave a family. And I think that's been recognised probably more likely by the Minister for Justice, who until now has been signing off on who gets out and, you know, when they can be released. So I think, yeah, so to answer your question, it's at the moment it's about 22 years. I mean, the longest, I think, at the moment in there is John Shaw, who's in since 1976 or something like that. And he was one of two Englishmen, him and Jeffrey Evans. They arrived in Ireland at the time with the plan to kill a woman every week. And they unfortunately did manage to kill 2 women before they were caught. So, I mean, you know, and that was, so I mean, he's in jail since then. Jeffrey Evans pretty much died in prison. He was, I think, one of the first people that they used an electronic tag on when he was in a coma in hospital.
And why were they in so long, like, compared to other people?
I think it's a recognition of the fact that their crimes were so horrendous. I mean, they were basically 2 serial killers, you know, that arrived in this country with the express intent to use their fate to kill a bird every week. So I mean, it was just the I suppose the unreconstructed. It was just the pure evil nature of the pair. What they went out on, and how can you ever say that someone like that is ever safe to release, even if they're elderly at this stage? And I mean, like, as far as I know, Evans is in Arbour Hill and recently had a couple of days out escorted visit. You know, so whether that's reward for good behaviour or whether it's you know, they're getting ready to release him remains to be seen. But I mean, like we did have some characters in the Irish prison system that were 40 plus years. There's one famous guy who's since passed away, Jimmy Yennis, who killed somebody, I think it was in the late 60s. But I mean, he literally came out of jail after being done for assault and badly beating up someone, and I think within days had killed the person who gave evidence against him. So, I mean, there was a good reason why he never came out. I remember it must be 15 or more, 20 years ago, even at this stage, we photographed him doing hedging work around, I think, Avoca or something like that in Wicklow, where he was getting out on day release from Shelton Abbey, the open prison there. So, but now, yeah, it definitely shows the longest. He's certainly the only person from the 1970s. There's a handful in from the 1980s. I think that there's definitely a few who are doing 30 plus years in prison, and there's some who are definitely going to be, they're not there yet, but they're going to be doing 30 plus years.
I regularly see Malcolm MacArthur around the city, hopping on and off buses, dressed very dapper. Obviously, when they are released, they're not allowed to do any interviews or communicate with the media. He has, I did approach him once and he told me that under no uncertain terms he was in no position to do an interview ever, because they're released, of course, on licence. So when they are released from their life sentences, if they commit another crime or if they break whatever their bail bonds are, they're straight back in again. Yeah,
I mean, and that's the thing I think people forget about. A life sentence is just that. Now, having said that, I did recently check this out because I was wondering if, somebody who's released on license, are they allowed to leave the country? But apparently they can eventually, if they're, once they meet all the requirements of their release conditions, that they turn up and they meet their parole officer and they, whatever, they find themselves work or they settle down or, to become upstanding members of the community again. Eventually they can work their way towards being pretty much a normal person once again and can take off and go live somewhere else. But I think for a lot of them, there is that prospect of, you're going to go back inside if you're found drunk on the street by the guards, which does happen. So I can't think of it now, but there was one recent case where, there was a guy in for a long time and he was out. He got out in 2006 or 2008 and then in 2014 or 15, he was back inside again and he's still inside, basically haven't gotten into a drunken fight on the street. So that was enough for him to have his life sentence reactivated. So it is something that's held over them for quite some time, and they have to work pretty hard to show that they're safe to be allowed back into the community.
Unreformed characters. Now, Helen McEntee, the current Justice Minister, has been signing off any of those releases. Will that continue with the situation with the parole board, which is changing its setup and it is becoming an independent entity?
No, it doesn't look like it. I mean, the parole board has actually been set up and it is now independent of the minister. I think there's 12 or 14 board members who make the final decision on whether or not somebody should get parole. Now they have changed, they haven't changed it yet, but they are talking about the increasing before they can be considered for parole. Now it was 7 years and it's up to 12, and I think Helen McEntee then was talking about legislation that would push that even further for particularly nasty crimes, particularly heinous crimes. So that hasn't happened yet. It's up in the air. So I mean, it'll go before. I think it's 3 of the board make a decision, and these are made up of. I had a look through the people who are currently on the board. So you have people from the probation service, people from the Irish Prison Service. You have retired chief superintendents. You have a current Garda superintendent. You have a couple of lawyers, a couple of judges, this sort of thing. So it's that kind of, it's across the board, but it's at that kind of senior management level I would think, rather than, people who've been necessarily on the ground who might have been, working with them. And I presume the IPS, well, not that I presume, I'm told that the IPS do have quite an input in it, in that you will have officers or staff members or whoever, psychologists in the prisons who are dealing with these people, and that they can put in their own reports to the parole board. But I think one of the things that they have to keep an eye on is where the families of the victims come into this. And basically you have to register as being next of kin. You have to make the argument that you are related, first of all, and you have to prove all that, and then you become the point of contact for your whole family. On the person, on the person who's serving life as a result of killing one of your relatives, and that you're then you're going to be consulted. And I mean, at the moment, they were up until now, you were basically getting a letter to say that there was, that so and so was has made an application before the parole board, which people used to find terrifying. I mean, we've all spoken to various people. I know the relatives of the woman killed by Ray O'Donovan down in Ennis. Like, I've spoken to some of the victim's family there, and it's traumatic for them. And Jeffrey or Warren Dumbrell's victim's family, I was in contact with them, and again, they just found it a frightening prospect that that the person who killed in the Dumbrell's case, the person who killed their father, is going to get out, and at the time, like he murdered that time, he had just finished another sentence for a violent crime. So I mean, like, there's some people, you wonder why they're even being considered for parole, and the idea of putting families through that kind of stress, I think, is unnecessary. So I don't know whether this is going to work, this new parole board system, because it is taking it out of the hands of the politicians, which is, you can argue, is good in one sense, that it's not a matter of public opinion or mob rule. But on the other side of it, then, where does public opinion come into this? I mean, if a single family says, no, we don't want to see that killer, ever be released. I mean, maybe they're wrong. If the victim in some cases, started the fight that got him and he was killed in it, you kind of go, well, you can make the argument, well, the killer, he didn't start it, but he did, but he certainly finished it. Whereas, as opposed to, a complete stranger attack by some, sex killer, there's a clear black and white difference there, but there's everything in between. So, I can see some serious controversies, coming down the line when the parole board say we got to release, so-and-so, and, and we're writing the stories with the whole history of what these people did.
Everything is in their hands, really. I have some first enough hand experience of parole boards through Joey O'Callaghan, who was the subject of my book, The Witness, and then the podcast. And his mother, Mary, is actually the point of contact for the prison. Every time there was a release date, she would get a letter, and obviously that would cause a huge amount of stress amongst the family. Brian Kenny and Thomas Hinchin are serving life sentences for the murder of Jonathan O'Reilly, and Joey obviously was the witness whose evidence put them away. So he remains frightened for his life that they will come for him. But what I found particular in it was every time there was a parole application, it was up to Joey and other members of his family and his victim's family to write in to the parole board to put their case as to why Brian Kenny or Hinchin shouldn't be released. And that was very traumatic for them, having to, bring back up the past and everything that had gone on. But also, particularly for Joey, was the fact that those letters were given on to the inmates. So Brian Kenny and Thomas Hinchin were getting his letters, and he had to be very careful and remain so what he puts in them. So as he doesn't reveal any personal information and all the rest of that. And that is something that other families have complained of as well, that it's up to them to keep the killer in prison. But yeah, at the same time, they are the people who have the particular interest, I suppose. So there's two sides to that.
And that is still the system. Looking at the parole board website earlier on today, and it does warn, the next of kin or the point of contact that, what you write to us will be passed on. So that hasn't changed, unfortunately.
And that's obviously for some sort of a right to reply situation, or I could never quite understand it, why those personal letters would have to be handed on.
Well, I suppose it's in the interest of justice that, it's like discovery in any case, that, you need to know what you're defending yourself against. So, there might be a better way of doing it so that families don't feel as exposed, that, that their letters or whatever is then turned into a parole board officer's affidavit, which then could be passed on or something like that to the prisoner. So it's not Nicola Tallant or Eamon Dillon who is saying, keep this man locked up. It's somebody saying, members of the family have told me that they want to see this person, and it's not as individualized in that sense. Yeah,
I think that could certainly help it. I remember Joey once saying to me that he hated the idea of Brian Kenny touching his handwriting or touching the piece of paper that he had held. But let's go back to the lifers and who they are in prison. In the Irish Prison Service, there are more than 300 inmates serving life.
It's about 350, including Brian Kenny and Thomas Hinchin, who killed Jonathan O'Reilly in 2004. They're when you think about it now, it's a long, long time. You know more about them than I do. But they were like seriously dangerous criminals, and they're away for for quite some time now at this stage. I think that's it's kind of the ongoing, I think, theme of gangland murders. When you look at some of them, when you go through the list, say from the mid 90s, you see there's an awful lot of unsolved murders. But I think part of that, and certainly in the case of the Crumlin-Drimnagh feud, is that some of the killers themselves are dead and they have been killed. The likes of Paddy Doyle being shot dead in south of Spain. Like, with him, how many, unsolved murders went to the grave with him? And there's more than just Paddy Doyle. But I mean, like in terms of the gangland stuff, like the guys who carried out like one of the most famous murders in the Limerick feuding, which is Kieran Keane. I mean, the five men that were sentenced, for his murder. And that was the famous night of the Long Knives. They lured them out as a double cross. Himself and Owen Tracy were stabbed, and Kieran Keane was shot dead. And the five of those, I think it was Judge Peter Carney was the trial judge, and he commented at the time that you can't really expect to be released any time, so long as the feud violence is still going on. And they're still inside, all five of them. The likes of Desi Dundon, David Stanners, James McCarthy. I think there's two of them now are in an open prison. There's certainly one of them. I think James McCarthy now is in the one in Black Lion in Cavan Loughlin House. So I mean he's on the road to, I suppose, certainly an easier regime.
What year did that kick off in? When was Kieran Keane killed?
I think it was 2002. And they were jailed almost like within a year. Those five guys, but I mean, it set off, like yourself. I mean, it just set off a whole wave of murders. And I mean, like outside of Dublin, Limerick probably has the most lifers doing time for gangland murders. I mean, you have like Gary Campion was a contract killer, for the gangs down there. And he's serving a double life sentence. So he shot dead the innocent bouncer Brian Fitzgerald again, and it was another very high profile case. Allegedly, he wouldn't let members of the Dundon gang in to sell drugs in the nightclub he worked. And then he was also the man behind. There was a fellow called Frankie Ryan was shot dead in Moy Ross. And I remember that the evidence at the time was something like, he knew him, and he got into the car with him, and Ryan had no idea that the guy sitting in and got into the car behind him was about to kill him, and he blew his brains out. So, like, I mean, he's in, like, when was that?
When you say he got a double life sentence, were they two separate trials for him?
There were two separate trials. They were completely two separate trials. So I suppose the idea there is it's belt and braces from the guard's point of view. If for some reason he wins an appeal on one of them, he still has the other life sentence to play out.
And when it comes to his parole, obviously that'll be more difficult for him to,
of course, yeah. And again, I imagine he'll have to do separate. He'll have to do separate parole applications. That he might get parole for one murder, but not the other. So I mean, it certainly looks like he's going to be one of the guys who's going to he's going to hit, past the 30-year mark.
But as such, it doesn't necessarily mean that he gets life for one, he gets life for the other. We're saying that the average sentence is now up to 22 years. It doesn't necessarily mean he will serve 44 years. He will serve. No, well, they're both running together, essentially.
They're both running at the same time, or concurrently, as they like to say in court. But they're both running. It's not like one starts after the other finishes, which I'm sure what some people would like to see. But I mean, it's and there was a bunch, like, there was. There's the Dundon brothers. Like, there's five of them. There's one of them not involved in crime. There's four of them then are, involved in crime. Ger Dundon is the only one that's not doing life sentence. So I mean, you have John, Desi, and Wayne, and significantly enough, Desi's in for the Kieran Keane murder, but then the other two guys are both in for their parts in the murders of two innocent men. Shane Gagan, who was the innocent rugby player who was mistaken for another somehow they seem to think he was another gangster, and he was shot dead. And then you have Roy Collins, who was shot dead, and that was ordered by Wayne Dundon. That was a very interesting trial. That was kind of really what broke the gang, that you had other members of the gang who basically said they had enough of their violence, enough of their bullying, and they kind of they turned state on them, and were able to come up with enough evidence to put them away. Now, of course, they weren't the triggermen. You had young John Dillon was found within hours, arrested within hours. Nathan Killeen was found hiding in an attic hours after the Collins shooting as well. So, I mean, they're all serving life as well for the same murder.
And, of course, Barry Doyle, the brother of the aforementioned Paddy Doyle, who met his end at the hands of the Kinahans in Spain in 2008. But Barry Doyle is serving life in relation to his role in the Limerick feud.
That was the Shangaga murder that was ordered by John Dundon. So that was his part.
And Barry Doyle had, at the time, he was said to have been taken into the arms as such of the Limerick gangsters after his brother's death, and he was sort of down on his luck, and it was said they brought him in and fed him with cocaine and basically gave him a job to do. Two brothers was an incredible story, really, and early end in their gangland careers. And he is also, I believe, in a relationship, Barry Doyle, and has been sort of now welcomed into the Kinahan fraternity within the prison system.
All right. Well, he doesn't seem to be good at backing winning horses, then, does he? In the long run,
no, he doesn't.
It certainly comes
Absolutely
to that.
not.
I mean, it's interesting though. I mean, how many of the hitmen themselves end up being targeted? I mean, that seemed to have been a pattern with Eamon Dillon, where a number of his suspected hitmen themselves were targeted. That and not necessarily the triggermen themselves, but people who were involved. It's Christopher Gilroy is missing, presumed dead, and he was suspected to have carried out a murder for the Don. So it's kind of a kind of a fast track to a short, quick criminal career. And I think there's something to that. That I suppose in one sense there might be criminals out there who kind of think, well, if you show you have the stuff, the courage or whatever you want to phrase it, to go out and pull a trigger and murder somebody, to make your bones, as they say in the American movies, like whether that's a motivation or something, I wonder. But it also means then that there's people out there thinking, we got to be careful of this guy, like he is capable of killing. And that comes to a point then where, we better shoot him before he kind of turns his eye on us. Or if you're the guy who's hired him or the woman who's hired him, you might decide, look, this guy knows, he knows that I was behind that. He's already come back once looking for extra money or help to do this. So he's got to go now as well. So, I mean, you kind of put a target on your own back, apart from the fact that you might have relatives of the person you murdered who have their own personal reasons for revenge then. So, I mean, deciding to become a gangland hitman or hit woman, I think is a ticket to nowhere really in the long run. And
all those decisions that you're talking about there, which are, very stark, but they are the business of gangland and the realities of that world. Kill or be killed. And sometimes it can save money and effort to take out an individual. Speaking of money, we've heard over the years, and in particular with the Kinahan-Hutch feud, the kind of rates that were being paid for murder. And, they certainly broke all the previous pay barriers. Up to 100,000 was on offer for certain individuals to be targeted and killed. But many people who are behind bars were either on the promise of money. I think probably I would consider the average for a hit to be between 40 and 50,000 for a high profile enough hit. But a lot of people serving life were being offered far less. We're looking at wiping out drug debts, which were tiny in the greater scheme of things, and who've literally given away their lives for, that bad decision.
Yeah, I mean, that was one thing, I suppose, that love-hate, I think, from all those crime journalists felt that they got right, was the way that, some of these gunmen were just manipulated. They were backed into a corner and they had no choice except to, carry out, the deed of taking someone else's life. And there's been a few, like when I was going through it there, in the last couple of weeks, we ran a series about lifers in the Sunday World, which is online if anyone wants to read them for themselves. But there's some pretty sad ones in one sense. Like, I mean, there is people who get sucked into it for other reasons than, doing it for the money or doing it for the kudos. It's either threats or misplaced loyalty, or, as we know in the case of David Patchell, it was he owed money and he shot a guy called Stephen O'Halloran in 2009. And again, it was, he claimed that he was wrongly accused of stealing a gang's cocaine and he was forced to kill O'Halloran, which he did. And while he was in custody then, his childhood pal, Paul Byrne, who had nothing to do with the murder, he ended up being abducted and his body was left undiscovered for a year. I don't know if you remember that one. His body was found up in the Dublin mountains. There's another guy, Jonathan Dunn, similar story. He'd been pressured by gangsters over lost drugs, and he shot his friend Ian Kenny with a shotgun in 2007. And that was an unusual case, that the guy, like Ian Kenny, he lingered for, I think, about a year or more. He was in a coma. So I think Dunn was already in prison for the shooting. And then when his friend passed away, he was put on trial for the murder and convicted of that. And again, it was over very little. Like, it was particularly, small amount of I think, money involved. I did something that there was another guy, I think it was kind of the Crumlin Drimnagh area, Warren Graham. Now he's in Lock and House. He's been in prison since 2010. And if I remember correctly, at the time of the trial, there was the Joyce gang from Coolock, who himself was since shot dead. That Warren was pretty much manipulated into this kind of bogus drug deal, where they were basically going to steal the drugs off this other guy, or steal the money. I can't remember which. And he ended up stabbing a guy to death. Now he actually turned up online recently. He was speaking to an Oireachtas committee, and he was saying that his life had been transformed through education, and he said, I think he finished off saying something like, I believe a strong majority of prisoners would make the most of a decent second chance. But he described his own life as being, pretty chaotic. He was using drugs at the time, and just ended up in this awful situation where, on the face of it, looked like, these guys should have backed down and they would have been able to carry out the robbery and nobody would have got hurt. But unfortunately, they fought back and he stabbed a man to death. And he's now in prison. What is it, 12 years? And the chances are he'll be in there for a while yet. Despite his young age when he went in. So I mean, like there's a lot of stories like that. I mean, to go back to the Don, if you remember, like there was a man, he was done for a double murder there on Pier Street, Gary Howard, and it seems to be, quite a hardened, killer at the age of 24. I mean, there was talks of him being suspect in other murders, but in his court, I think it came out, I'm not sure if it was the court hearing, but it certainly came out that he was alleging that the Don had put a gun in his mouth, and that, and he was basically no choice except to go out and carry these murders, and that he himself at the time felt that he himself was a target and was going to be lined up. So, here's a guy who was 24 and he's in jail, and he's going to be in jail for a long time. On the back of that, again, he probably saw nothing of it. He probably saw nothing of that cash. And I mean, there's, one of the Wilsons that was shot dead. The Wilsons, they're a family of hitmen themselves, and John Wilson himself was murdered. And he was shot dead by Keith O'Neill in 2012. And it came out there as well that Keith O'Neill, he complained that he never got the €40,000 that he'd been promised to carry it out. So it's just, it's just the way that the prisons are full of people who've made, really bad choices in one after the other, and ends up, I suppose this is the pinnacle in a sense, that they go as far as taking someone else's life.
You mentioned there the Crumlin Drimnagh feud, which of course ran through the year 2000s up until about 2010, and there's only 2 people in jail in relation to murders that were assigned to that feud, which took 16 lives. But there's been far more success in convictions when it comes to the Kinahan-Hutch feud, which is still, okay, thankfully there haven't been any murders in a while, but I wouldn't think it's over as such if either side maybe get an opportunity. But from early on, there was a handle got on that feud that wasn't maybe got on other ones. And I'm just trying to tot up how many are in prison. Okay, look, we have said before, there's more than 60 members of the Kinahan cartel in prison for various crimes, including money laundering, etc. But for actual murder, and I think the biggest head on the plate there was Fat Freddie Thompson, who of course would have been led one side of the Crumlin Drimnagh feud and became almost blooded in that when he came to the Kinahan-Hutch feud. He was somebody who was vastly experienced in organising murders, but he was actually jailed. I was there the day that he was convicted of murder, and it really was a celebratory moment for everybody, because such a dangerous individual who had certainly no plans to reform and had been involved in so much tragedy and violence over his life. But he and Lee Canavan are serving prison terms, life terms, for the murder of Daithí Douglas. David Hunter, Eamon Cumberton, Johnny Keogh, Regina Keogh. 5 there that I have noted that are in for murder as such. There's many more in for conspiracy to kills, where the would-be victim survived because of the actions and the intelligence levels coming into the Gardaí. But that's quite a lot. That's quite a heavy toll.
You have Tussie Fox as well, of course.
Tussie Fox, yeah, of course. So that's 6 of them.
Yeah, and when you look at it, when you consider how many are in, like, there's very few of them, relatively speaking, it's 10% or less than 10% are doing life. But there's so many. I mean, there was other jail sentences. The guy who bought the phone or got the car, in the in the bar murder, weren't aware of that. And I mean, and even if you look at Regina Keogh, I mean, her role in it was pretty minor. Well, you can argue it was pretty minor, and she's serving life. I mean, she basically persuaded a friend of hers to allow the 2 men to use the flat to keep a lookout for Gareth Hutch when he arrived in, so they could shoot him. And she left I think she left a pair of gloves, or she left surgical gloves in the flat for them to use. And that was the extent of her role. But that's considered in Irish law. It's joint enterprise. You're facilitating someone to murder. I think I can't remember the chap's name, but the guy who bought the phones in the bar murder, I think, had no idea like what was going on. And he certainly was able to make that argument, and he was successful in court. And so he's serving a much lesser sentence, even though you could argue that the phones might have played a bigger role than what Regina Keogh did. But the fact that she knew what was going to happen, I think, and obviously did nothing to stop it, is what puts her into that level of guilt, and it's a life sentence.
And you're dead right about her, Eamon, because I was in court actually when she was convicted as well, and Justice Tony Hunt, who presides over a lot of those Gangland trials, he almost felt sorry for her in handing down his judgment. He basically explained that to her, that under Irish law, there is no lesser charge. In the States and sometimes in the UK, you have various degrees of murder as such. But here in Ireland, it's just one way or the other. And she was charged with that, and she was convicted of it on the evidence. And so therefore a life sentence, and her 5 children left motherless. And I think on appeal she failed as well.
Well, you'd imagine this is the sort of issue then now that the parole board will play a role in this, where they'll see, well, Regina Keogh played a far lesser role, and she might get parole a lot sooner than her brother and Tussie Fox. But we'll have to wait and see. It could be a few years. We might even be retired by then.
Yeah, but I think, I will hope, but kicking back somewhere in the sunshine. But I have to say, from a humane point of view, definitely, her decision was bad. She gave up her apartment as a lookout post for somebody's murder. She knew that's what it was for, but at the same time, she didn't pull the trigger. And certainly I do think sometimes when you see people, being put away for life, when, others who may have had what we would consider, civilians would consider, far... I mean, I think sometimes when and I know they're changing the sentencing and of it, but plotting to kill, you just basically didn't get there. You had the same mindset, you had the same focused outcome in your head, but perhaps the guards moved in at the last minute and you were arrested as opposed to actually, but I would see that as a far more significant crime than maybe somebody who was, and I think she had a history of addiction, etc. as well, gave her home up for money. The Gangland killers are one thing. I think 85 of them make up the 350 lifer population in prison. But some of these guys that you wrote about that got the maximum sentences involved in sex assault and rapes, my God, their crimes are horrific. And many of them have been there for so long that we've forgotten about them. But the first one I think you mentioned in your piece was a guy called Thomas Stokes, in jail since 1996. And I think many women would hope that he wouldn't be stepping foot outside for another while.
Yeah, I mean, he was 36 years of age when he went into prison in 1996. So, I let you do the maths there now to figure out, like, so he's in.
You know how bad I am at that.
He's in prison a long time, and he's not in an open prison either at this stage, I can tell you. And what he did was, there was another man with him who was somewhat less, I think less culpable, but they picked up a vulnerable 20-year-old woman. Now at the time, like, it's funny reading back, even if it is the Irish Times in 1997, the language they used to describe people is quite different to now. But it appears, according to reports at the time, that the vulnerable 20-year-old woman was basically working as a prostitute on the street, and they picked her up, and they agreed to, she agreed to carry out a sex act, in the car around the corner, and that his friend in the car was going to be hopping out before anything would happen. But instead, he drove her up he went up to the Wicklow Mountains, and subjected, like, there was horrific detail in the court case, which I don't think we'll go into here, but it was pretty much pretty awful stuff, and it went on for 2.5 hours. She genuinely thought she was going to die. There was quotes like from her to according to the guards, he told me to shut up or he'd bury me. I told him I wanted to go home to my kids and my mother. He kept calling me a tramp. I never thought I'd see another face again. Like, he stopped for a cigarette break, like, while he was raping her. And it really was, it was torturous. And then, of course, it emerged that he had previous convictions, that he had done a 4-year sentence for sexual assault in 1984. And then in England in 1989, he got a 6-year sentence for threatening to kill his wife when he poured petrol through her letterbox. So, there's a guy, if anyone deserves to be, locked up for a long time, which he has been, I think he ticks most of the boxes, certainly, by any standard. It's such a premeditated, such a cruel, callous, like, and I have really glossed over, like, what went on. It's far worse. If somebody wants to take the time to go look it up themselves, they can, but I'm not going to repeat the nature of it. But there was believe it or not, there's a similar character, like, who's in prison. He's like a serial rapist, a man called David Geraghty. Now he's age 56. Now, like, from a technical point of view, what's interesting is that he actually got an indeterminate sentence in the UK in 1998, which is a sentence that they don't do here. They were doing this thing. Basically, it's called the whole of life sentence in the UK, which I think the European court said you're not actually allowed to do that. You can't sentence someone for the rest of their natural life. So he's been transferred back, or he got himself transferred at some point back to Ireland. So effectively, he's treated as a lifer. So presume he will at some point be eligible for parole. And the interesting thing again, like, this is a guy, he had a career as a rapist. There was a career of two halves. That he had been jailed in Ireland in the 1980s for 4 years over 7 sex attacks, including rape. He moved to the UK. He married a woman who had no idea of his past, had kids, and then he was caught for 2 rapes. One of them was a 22-year-old French hitchhiker that he picked up, and the attempted rape of a pregnant 16-year-old. So again, another, it's just another wonderful character. The judge described him as a person of an unstable character, likely to commit similar offences in the future. So again, that's a man who's been in prison, like Stokes. He's been in prison since the mid 90s, and you would be expecting that people like them, they'd be very careful about letting them back out on the street.
Absolutely, hugely dangerous to women, both of those characters. So rape itself as a criminal charge, it carries up to life imprisonment. Is that the case?
Yeah, and as far as I remember, there's other kidnap as well is something that can attract a life sentence. There's a couple of there's a couple of different offences which, when you're in a circuit court and you see somebody expecting a 3 or 4 year sentence, and the judge starts explaining their sentencing regime and says the headline offence, or not the headline offence, but the highest the highest sentence for this crime is life, and you can see people sort of blanching very quickly in the thing, in the box. They're rarely given out in this country, and when I was going through this, I noticed that it was Judge Peter Carney who was the judge who had actually sentenced a number of these. Stokes is the first person to have got a life sentence for a non-murder, so to speak. But there was another, as far as I could see, there was one other man who got a life sentence, but he won on an appeal. I remember there was another case there, and the man was recently released. He was a former Polish army officer who attacked and raped a couple in their house in, I think it was Edenderry. and he got life as well. I think he would have been, one of the I think only the third or fourth that would have got life, or even less than that. And he won on appeal, and that was changed to a 15-year sentence. I mean, that's why you wonder, people say, well, why didn't Larry Murphy get life? The famous, Wicklow rapist. You wonder, famous is probably the wrong way to put it, the infamous, notorious rapist. And you wonder why, but he didn't have a previous. So, I mean, that's really how he avoided it. I mean, he did get a long sentence. He got 15 years at the time. But you see, again, I think there has to be that kind of, that has to be that previous. I mean, you have another guy from Tipperary, David Power. Now, he was 25 when he launched a random attack on a woman who was on her way home from a nightclub with her boyfriend and went into a Supermax restaurant in Neenah in January 2007 while her boyfriend waited for her. She went in to use the toilet and he pushed her inside. And again, he attacked her, he raped her. It was a very serious assault. And then it turns out he'd been jailed for 2 other sex attacks in 2001. And one of those victims at that time, this is for the previous rape, had said something and it was Judge Carney who was the sentencing judge in both cases. She had said, like, he was an evil man. I've no doubt he'd re-offend, and I want justice for what he has done to me to prevent it from happening to another woman. So he got 5 years. He got out again. He did it again, and the same judge said, I gave you a chance before, and he jailed him for life. So, it's a tragic case to think that there was a chance that the woman in Neenah could have. It could have been avoided, the attack on her. But I suppose, Judge Carney, who since passed away, was sticking to the, he was sticking to the rules. He was sticking to the way judgments are formulated. And you can't blame him, like, in that sense. But, you can't really see they don't have crystal balls. They can't see into the future what way things are going to happen.
And to add to the horror of that Supermac toilet attack, I recall at the time reading that the music was blaring and her screams couldn't be heard because of that. Not that the rape itself was as horrific as it was, but the idea that you were calling for help and there was probably people milling about buying burgers outside and they just couldn't hear her. And just to point out really the difference, I suppose, between somebody getting a life sentence for these sex attacks, be they rape or assaults, and kidnaps, like you've mentioned, and other crimes that do carry this maximum sentence. The difference is that in murder, it's mandatory. So it's not, actually, they don't even have sentence hearings. They are literally taken down from the dock to serve their life sentence. But these sentences that are handed out by judges, even if you're a veteran in the court, sometimes you can be slightly confused by them. It's a mathematical decision. They have to look at the maximum, the minimum. They have to look at where the crime is in between those two, and then they have to look at the aggravating factors and the mitigating ones. And as you say, in the case of Larry Murphy, that clearly would have been the fact that he had no previous convictions, hadn't come to the attention of the police before, etc. The Athlone rapist, one of the worst stories I've ever had to cover in all my days, and I have covered some horrible stories. 2015, 2 children were attending a party, and this guy, who we've never been able to name because of the identity of the victims, but he lured them from the party, and you'll have to tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, this is an afternoon. This is like a kid's birthday party, presumably bouncy castle sort of stuff, and he approached the 2 girls, 6 and 9, said that his own daughter wanted to come out and play, but she was too shy, and would they come and try and get her to come out and play with them? And he brought them to a derelict house, and it was just horrific. Just again, I'm just going to gloss over the details because it's just horrific. I mean, he threatened to slit their throats, like he threatened to kill their parents. So you can imagine a 6 and 9-year-old, and you're being told this man, who you're going to believe him, he's going to kill you. And I mean, he raped them both. I mean, presumably in the presence of the other. And it was only at one point then when he left, they were brave enough to climb out of the window and they raised the alarm. And if you remember at the time, there was a brief period where, the story broke and nobody knew who this rapist was. And there was a real level of fear. I mean, this is like the nightmare of parents. And I mean, and thankfully it is so rare. Like, I mean, it barely, this type of attack, barely comes up on statistics. I mean, I can't recall in the years I've been working, a crime, quite as bad as this one. Now, I'll come on to another one in a minute when you can argue which is worse. But I think this is, it is one of the worst. And again, like, he pleaded guilty and he cooperated with the guards. And again, it was Judge Peter Carney. He said the offences were just too serious to consider a reduction in the maximum sentence, and he sentenced him to life. And it's hard to find any reason why, why the judge was wrong on that. And it was appealed to the court and it was upheld. So, I mean, it was as far as the legal system, the judiciary is concerned, it was the right decision.
When I was down covering that at the time and it had just happened, people were actually speechless. I was speechless myself. I mean, there was just no words for it. It was just, and the little 9-year-old had tried to protect the little 6-year-old, and depraved is not the word for it. Did we know anything while he was never named and can't be identified? And that is to protect his victims, Eamon, not him. Do we know much about him or his background? There
was bits. I mean, like, he had 120 something convictions, but I mean, it was basically drink related, drug addiction related kind of crime. It was all that pretty much nuisance stuff. I mean, he certainly wasn't as far as I can remember now, I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that there was no serious sexual assaults or rape or anything like that in his history. So whatever happened on that day, I mean, young enough. I mean, he was, I think he's early 30s when it happens, so, I mean, he amassed up all those criminal convictions, and paper looks bad, but I mean, it was pretty much it was stemming from his addiction and drink problems rather than his
addictions. And usually people with addiction and drink problems are really to be pitied, and a lot of them that do have these loads of convictions, they are all nuisance stuff and they're public order offences and they're this, that and the other, and it is really as a result of their addiction, their behaviour. So you don't often see somebody in drug or drink addiction doing something like this. So he certainly was a rarity, but no explanations or any sense or meaning to it. Michael Murphy, another bad egg.
Yeah, I think he definitely qualifies for the title of bad egg. All right. I mean, I think this is a guy who was he's an Irish native, but he was one of these guys who got an indeterminate sentence in the UK in 1994. He raped a woman and then killed her, stabbing her 33 times. And he was detained in a secure mental institution. Sorry, no, that's the right way to phrase that, in Manchester. But he escaped in 2006. And less than a year later, he ended up in Temple Bar, and he got chatting. Presumably, he had a Manchester accent at this stage. He'd grown up. He'd grown up there. He'd left Mayo as a young kid. And I think he was actually, believe it or not, he was actually convicted of the manslaughter of his own father as well, who was described in court at the time as a violent alcoholic, and he was given an 18-month suspended sentence for that. So this is before he raped the woman in 1994 in Manchester, and before he turns up in Temple Bar in 2006. And basically he met two English tourists. They were over, two women out in Temple Bar, presumably part of a hen or something. They said, come on, we'll have a couple more drinks in our room. And this wasn't like a romantic liaison. This wasn't like, let's come back for sex in the bed, in the bedroom. It was come back and keep the party going. And her evidence was that her friend fell asleep in the chair, and she went to show him out. And just as he was about to walk out, he turned and he punched her full force in the face, dragged her into the bathroom, what do you say? Violently raped her. You don't gently rape someone, but but there was an added element of physical of violence. Like he continued to assault her physically as well as raping her, and she was screaming, trying to wake up her friend, who eventually did wake up and then ran screaming into the corridor. He managed to drag her back. I think the woman herself tried to get out. She was naked at this stage, and then when her friend ran into the corridor, he went after her, and then she was able to escape the room as well. And he was arrested pretty soon after that. So, I mean, now it was George Birmingham in this case. Was the judge gave him the life sentence, and he described him as a highly dangerous man whose threat to society is ongoing. He said a life sentence for rape was unusual, but there was exceptional circumstances for what he described as a truly appalling rape. So, I mean, this is kind of, I suppose, this is the level you've got to get to kind of, to reach that bar, to get, a life sentence for not killing somebody. What's worse? I mean, you can argue that maybe there's a lot more rapists should be getting life sentences, and it shouldn't be just,
almost the sole preserve of killers.
Are they mainly housed together then in the prison system? And if they're not, how are they, other inmates, how do they behave towards them? You hear these stories about how there is hierarchy systems within the prison, and even within the sexual offenders community. Some sexual offenders will look down their nose on others and see themselves as, as higher up the ladder than them. But these guys must be deplored in prison and out.
Yeah, well, I suppose the gangland killers are different. Yeah, but certainly, the sex killers, the majority of them, as far as I can see, as far as I know, are in the Midlands and in Arbour Hill. I think the older guys are in Arbour Hill. They're less likely to get involved in physical violence with other members of other people who are detained as well. I think the more dangerous people, the more manipulative ones are in the Midlands. So the likes of Graham Dwyer would be serving his time in the Midlands. I remember that I know from my own information that there is a landing where the people on it are considered so manipulative they can't be allowed to mix with other prisoners, and not all of them are serving life. I don't even remember the case. Again, I'm sorry now, the name escapes me immediately, but there's one guy now, he's serving life for murdering the Blaine brothers in Claremorris. And when he was previously in jail, he was trying to manipulate another vulnerable prisoner into killing himself, to the point where he was making up fake, doctor's notes and saying, "Oh, I stole this in the office," and putting it under his cell door, and suggesting that he take his own life. So some of these characters are horrendous. I suppose it goes across the entire scale. From the poor, not the poor, but the bad decision made by someone who was addicted or sucked into gangland and thought that this is a way out by doing this one thing, all the way up to people like Graham Dwyer, who callously and horrifically manipulated a vulnerable woman into becoming his victim. So
yeah, and tried to groom others. I'll just help you out with the Blaine brothers. Jack Blaine, 76, his 69-year-old brother Tom, both died as a result of blunt force trauma following the attack on their home in July 2013, and 32-year-old Alan Cawley of Ballina is serving the life sentence for that. So he was the man you're referring to as the one who tried to convince a fellow inmate to kill himself.
And that was just a horrendous case. They were two vulnerable, like pensioners. One of them used to call to a nearby pub for a cup of tea. I remember speaking to the bar manager there at the time. I spoke to a relative as well. As far as I remember, like in Cawley's case, like he'd been out of jail, he'd been out of Castlereagh for another attack of some sort, and he'd been talking to, I think it was an American nurse or somebody who was in a bar, and they kind of got a feeling about him and left. And so you wonder, it really was to some extent a thrill kill. It was one of these people who just went out to see what it was going to be like. Which actually brings me back to one of the people who were serving life for not actually killing anyone. Is Eric Daniels. He was a young man. He's now 38. He tried to kill a 10-year-old girl in 2001 in Clonmel, and he took a shoelace out, wrapped it around her neck, and tried to strangle her. And luckily, obviously the kid was, she was a smart young girl. She played dead, and he left her alone and walked off. And he later told the guards he wanted to inflict pain. He wanted to see what it was like to kill someone. So there are people out there, unfortunately, there are people out there who just want to see what it's like to kill someone, or, at some point they're getting a sick, thrill out of it. And all we can hope is that they're few and far between.
Yeah, and that they remain locked up. Now, obviously prisons are there, and as a society we believe that people can become reformed characters and can come out and become valuable parts of communities. And prisons are places that they can reform, that they can feel remorse, that they can be educated, that they can change their ways. But some of these people I think we've spoken about today, the reason they're on life sentences is because they are very unlikely to reform. And I think the longer those sentences continue, the better for the community. So, Eamon Dillon, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola.
You've been listening to Crime World, a podcast from SundayWorld.com, produced by Ian Mullaney and edited by me, Nicola Tallant. If you like the podcast and love true crime, why not download the free SundayWorld.com app for lots more stories from Ireland and across the globe.